Alright, so today I'm gonna reviewing all the new Mythic cards we got from War of the Spark. Now this video is slightly delayed because I kinda had a cold and I sounded like Batman for a couple of days. I kinda missed that. It was kinda awesome having that voice, but it was itching like crazy. Now my voice is still itching like crazy, but I should be able to go through these cards without too many issues. Anyway, let's get started, and let's start with Gideon Blackblade. Obviously, this is one of the better Mythic we got from War of the Spark, and if you're playing anything that includes white and you're using creatures, I would auto-include this card. It is just amazing. This together with an add-on to Vanguard, I played this in my mono-white deck, and I had people forfeit on turn 3 when I played this and had a Vanguard out. It is just incredible. Obviously, what makes him so good is, 1, it's very hard to deal with if it comes out early on. 2, he gives another creature either indestructibility, lifelink, or vigilance. Of course, if you do it on a Daunted Vanguard, well, what is your opponent gonna do? You have a lifelink, a Daunted Vanguard that is attacking and can make himself indestructible for only 1 life. It's just incredible, and yeah. You should own 3 to 4 copies if you're playing white creatures. There's just nothing like this in mono white at the moment. Anyway, let's move on to the second card, and this one is a bit more questionable. For 5 mana you get a 3/6 with double strike, and whenever you cast a creature spell you get a 4/4 black zombie warrior creature token. Now, just like with all other god cards, if this gets killed or exiled, instead of actually going through graveyard or being exiled, you put it top 3 from top of your deck and get to draw it in 3 turns. This is obviously really good and really hard to deal with. Now, the one weakness is this card, and that's about it. Now, this one, however, as I already said, it's a bit meh. It's a bit slow. Sure, you get zombies, but for 5 mana you're basically getting nothing until your next turn. So it's not really that good, and I wouldn't really recommend it. I'm not saying it's terrible, but it's not a card that like you need to make a deck work. Gideon Blackblade, you pretty much need to make a deck really effective when it comes to tier 1 gameplay. Now, obviously, if you're playing super casual, then you can pretty much make whatever card you want, but this is more towards people who are looking for a more competitive viewpoint. Anyway, let's move on to the second version of Gideon. Now, this one is a bit more questionable. It's a bit too expensive to play in competitive. It's one of those, if you're already winning, this one makes you win harder, but if you're losing, it's unlikely you're gonna have any use for this guy whatsoever. His passive is questionable because you need to have 2 creatures attacking that is not Gideon himself to get this passive to work. And if you are positioned late in the game to actually be able to use this passive, you have probably already won the game, or probably you're attacking with 2 saplings against the dragon or something. Like, it's just not very feasible that it's gonna work in a competitive environment. Let's move to a card that is quite good, and that's gonna be Final of Glory. Now, this is basically a white March of the Multitude. Instead of making Sapperling, you get 2/2 soldiers. And yeah, it's just a really good card. Obviously, fits really well in mono white and gives you a way to actually come back late into the game. That has always been the problem for any kind of creature deck, that usually late in the game, if something gets wiped, you don't really have an answer. With this, you could actually overwhelm your opponent with enough tokens to actually, win the game, even in a late game situation where you have to rely upon top decking. And yeah, this card is overall really good. Obviously, you don't want 4 copies, but as a single copy, it wouldn't hurt to include in mono white. And once we have the rotation occur, you can probably include this in your new version of the token deck if you're gonna have one to make that particular deck work. But that's in the future. Overall, this is a good card, and I would definitely recommend you owning it if you're interested in either tokens or any kind of deck that includes creatures and plays white. Let's move on to the first blue card, and it's gonna be the Blue God. Now, this one is kinda meh. At the start of your turn, you may reveal your top card, and if it is a instant or sorcery, you may cast that card as a copy and you pay 2 less. But if you're playing control, you're gonna reveal a counterspell, you're gonna reveal a wrath. I guess if you reveal a discard, it would be okay, But then again, it's unlikely that you're actually gonna waste 4 mana at some point to get this guy out. And if you're playing Control Mirror, this is probably never gonna see play. Again, it's just a bit too questionable, and it doesn't really fit into any deck really. Maybe as a one-off, but I would certainly not recommend that you craft this for anything but fun meme deck. Let's move on to Jace, and this one is really meh. 6 mana, and you get your standard draw 1 card, and whenever you draw more than 1 card per turn, you get to put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. This one is really meh, and I would definitely not recommend this for like anything, not even for meme decks. Like, I would see you rather craft the Guard Eternal rather than the Jace if you just want to have fun with meme decks. Alright, so let's move on to the final revelation. Now this is a draw card, and it's quite good, but it's mainly good if you're playing any summit strategy or any kind of ramp with green. In a control deck, there's no reason to include this or to have a copy of this really. You're never going to resolve it for 10 to get the extra effect, so against a control mirror matchup, this is never going to see play. But if you're playing, well, if you're playing the summit deck or anything with ramp, this is not a bad card. What it does is, once you reach X10, you get to reshuffle your graveyard into your library, and if you're playing Summit, that is something you probably want to do. You do draw quite a lot of cards, and in that deck I could certainly see this fitting in as a 1 to 2 copy. Anyway, let's move on, and we're gonna move on to the black card. Now this one is kinda meh. For 5 mana you get a 5/6 that allows you to sacrifice your own creatures to draw a card, which is basically, this is for all the things with Afterlife, and that's about it. Overall, I cannot see a bright future for this guy. He's just a bit meh, really, and you should probably save your Mythic wildcards for something better. Let's move to the card that is actually the hardest card to review in the entire set, and that's going to be Liliana. This card is not a card that's going to win you the game on its own unless you are already winning. However, she's not useless, and she's certainly very good. I need to see her used in sanctioned events and in tournaments and SCG Opens, etc. to get a good feeling for what her final value is gonna be like. At the moment I have a really hard time saying if you should or should not craft her. I'm gonna leave it like this. You're not gonna be unhappy owning her, but you're not required to own her to make a deck work. Again, as of right now, I cannot actually give a proper recommendation. I'm gonna say don't craft her, but don't be sad if you open her. It's not gonna be like with Jace, which, well, if you open this guy, you probably are gonna cry. But once I make my updated Mythic crafting guide later on, I'm gonna have a final conclusion for Liliana. Let's move on to Final of Eternity. Now this card is not that good. If it bypassed Hexproof, I would say this could be like good 1-off or 2-off, but because it is a targeted card, I'm not really going to recommend that you craft this. I would rather see you use either Ritual of Soth or Cry of the Canarium as your black board clear rather than this. Again, you could play Murder or like anything, or a dog or anything, and it would be better than wasting Mythic Wildcard on this card. Again, if this went through Hexproof, I would say yes, but as it is, I'm gonna say meh. I mean, maybe with the new land that can surpass Hexproof, but once again, it's a bit too expensive to make all that work. So I'm gonna say do not craft this card, it is just kinda meh. And let's move on to the first red card, and this one is actually really good. Now before I start talking about the card, I'm actually gonna talk about something completely irrelevant to this video, but it's kind of funny. Because the first time I looked at this card, I looked at the art and I was like, oh, this is cool. Then I looked really closely at the art and I was like, I kind of burst out laughing. I was looking at the legs and all I keep seeing is the legs of a cat. I keep seeing a house cat legs. I don't know how to describe it. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it had me laughing quite a lot and it kind of ruined the art for me. I'm not saying the art is bad, the art is amazing, but those legs, those stripy legs looking like a house cat, I just can't unsee it. Sorry if I ruined the card for you. Anyway, let's now review the card itself. This one is really good. This is the red guard, and like all other guards, if you kill it or exile it, it just comes back in a few turns. So the only way to actually deal with this is, well, discard it from your opponent's hand. Now what this card does is when it attacks, you get to put a creature from your hand in already attacking position together with the Razor Boar to attack your opponent. It is really good and you can cheese out some really big creatures, and overall it's a good card. At first you might think the mana cost is kinda high, but we have so many ways to ramp mana in standard at the moment that you can quite easily get this out on turn, let's see, well, turn 3 and turn 4. Turn 4 is more probably, turn 3 is more of a lucky if you get everything in the right order, but it's not impossible. And imagine having a Razor Boar rushing at you together with a Hellkite or anything with a huge attack number on turn, well, 4 or 5. It would be quite a devastating situation. So yeah, if you're playing anything that includes ramp and red, which means playing, well, either Jund or just playing green-red, this is certainly a card you want to include, and I would say as many as 3 to 4 copies. The card is just very good and very versatile, and obviously because it can't easily be dealt with, it makes it really good. Anyway, let's move on to a card that is, well, this card is good, but what were they thinking when they printed this? This is basically a big last middle finger. When you're playing against mono red, they play Final of Promise and you die. What it does is, once you pay the mana cost, you get to choose a instance and a sorcery card in your graveyard and recast them. Which means if you are like at 5 HP, well, and it's later in the game, let's now enjoy taking a Lightning Strike followed by a instant Lightning Strike. Not the instant Lightning Strike, but by an instant Wizard's Lightning, something like that, and you die. Overall, the card is very good, but for anything but mono red, I would stay away from it. Now, if you do play mono red, I'd say you would probably want to include like a single copy of this in every single mono red deck, or anything that uses burn, just as your finisher. Now, if you're playing best of 3s, I would put this in the main board and move Banefire to the sideboard. And of course, if you're playing as blue, bring back in the Banefires. But overall, this card is really good. However, you don't need many copies to make it work. And it's, once again, it's not a card that's gonna win you the game in every single game. But it is a card that's really good to have a copy of. But it's not a requirement. Again, it's not like Teferi in control decks, which is kinda required. Anyway, let's move on to the Green Guard. Right now you don't need to own him, but you will certainly not be unhappy opening him unless you don't like playing tokens. But overall the card is good, just not good enough as of right now to compete with all the other things we have. For example, you can play a Dryad and permanently buff all your creatures for the same mana cost. But the card is not bad. And once rotation occurs, I'm gonna say you're probably gonna want at least 3 copies, just as you used to do with the Dryad. Let's move on to my favorite Mythic card in this entire set, and that's gonna be Final of Devastation. This is basically a new version of Green Sun Zenith. The difference from Green Sun Zenith is this one allows you to search your graveyard and your library for a creature with converted mana cost of X or lower and put it on the field. Green Sun Zenith had the restriction of only green creatures, or well, anything with green mana in it, as well as being 1 less forest to actually cast. But I don't know, I feel like this one is just better, especially for standard. Obviously this is the ultimate toolbox card. You can fetch anything you want from your graveyard and from your deck. Like, what else is there to say? This card is amazing. Obviously I'm a bit biased towards it, but if you're playing anything green and creatures, this is a card that you definitely want, and I'm gonna say as many as, let's say, 3 copies. I was almost gonna say 4, but because of the mana cost, I'm gonna have to move it down to 3 copies. I don't think you actually want a full playset like you wanted with Green Sun Zenith. However, the card is really good if you're playing green creatures. Now do remember, you're not casting the creature, you're putting it on the battlefield. So if you try to fetch a Hydroid Krasis, you will get a 0/0 tiny jellyfish that dies. So you can't fetch... Well, if you want to fetch Hydroid Krasis to the graveyard, sure. But otherwise, you can't fetch him and make use of him. But overall, the card is just quite amazing, and you certainly do want him if you're gonna play anything that includes green and creatures. Certainly this is gonna fit very well into any kind of ramp deck and any kind of red-green creature deck. It might not fit as well into Sultai. Actually, it's terrible in Sultai, so don't craft this if you want it in Sultai, but for anything else that using green creatures, go ahead and craft 3 to 4 copies. 4 because you probably want that eventually, but 3 is something you probably want to look at as a goal. Anyway, let's move on to our final 4 card, and the first one is Tezzeret. Now this one is terrible. 6 mana. There's no way you're gonna ramp him out unless you play green, but you're gonna play Llanowar Elf to ramp out a Tezzeret to get affinity for artifact. The card overall doesn't make any sense and it's just too expensive. Overall, I would never recommend that you craft this card unless you want to make some fun artifact deck, but in a competitive environment, no. Let's move on to another meh card, and that's gonna be the Apex Hybrid. A bit too expensive, it's not that really that relevant, there's too much exile to really make him useful at the moment. Or him/her, I think it's a him, looks like a him. Anyway, the card is not very good. Now, if you do play Merfolk, I would recommend this card actually, because you do have quite a lot of but quite a lot of +1/+1 counter generation in Merfolk decks. But that's pretty much the only deck I would say that you would actually want this guy for. But again, it's not really required. Now, we have seen Merfolk in SCG tournaments. Well, we've seen it once this year, so take it for what you will when it comes to competitive viability. Let's move on to Nicholas Bolas, and this one is kinda meh. At first glance it looks kinda okayish, at least his abilities, but there are other things you could use instead that would be more powerful. It is one of those cards that do suffer from the fact it looks good at first glance, then you realize I could play this instead, and then it kind of fades in the background. But the card is not terrible, there are just better options if you want to use Planeswalkers. I would not recommend that you craft this guy if you're looking for a competitive Mythic, but if you want to make fun decks, this could actually work. It's not like the Jace situation where the card is actually terrible. Anyway, let's move on to the final card, and this one is just a meme card. This is the Mythic Reborn. It's a 5-color card and you get to do some funky stuff with it once you play it, but that's about it. It's not a competitive card because at the moment we don't have a competitive rainbow deck. I'm gonna call it Rainbow. I think that actually is the accurate name, but I can't remember. Anyway, before I conclude this video, I'm just gonna go over the recommendations really fast. So, Gideon Blackblade, 3 to 4 copies. We have Final of Glory, 1 to 2 copies, probably 4 copies once rotation occurs, but that is for later. A single copy of Final of Revelation if you're playing gate decks and using Summit, that's about it. I don't recommend crafting Liliana right now, but she might become better later on. I need more data on her. I would recommend 3 to 4 copies of the Razorboar if you play any creature deck that using, well, red, so red-green mainly. As of right now, I don't recommend the Green God, but once rotation occurs, this is a card you probably want to replace the Dryad that will rotate in a few months. But as of right now, you don't need to own it, but I would still recommend that you probably go for 3 copies if you are interested in tokens, but otherwise stay away from it. Next up, I do recommend 3 to 4 copies of Final Devastation if you're playing any deck that includes green creatures, except Sultai. If you're playing Sultai, do not craft this card because it will not fit well into Sultai, because you are putting your creatures on the battlefield so you don't get the cast effect. So overall, in Sultai decks, this would be a complete waste, but otherwise this card is really good, 3 to 4 copies. And that pretty much concludes this video. Those are my quick recommendations, and we will see what the future holds. Obviously, once the expansion gets, well, in the middle of the expansion, I will update my Mythic crafting guide and I will see if I make any changes to my recommendations then. But as of right now, these are my recommendations. And that will conclude this video. My throat is itching like crazy and my mouth is slightly bleeding, but overall, I managed to get through this. So I will catch you guys next time. This is Project signing out.